One of the issues that can arise when you remake a movie or do a prequel to a movie or even a sequel to a movie that is as popular within its genre as John Carpenter's The Thing, which, as I've said before on the channel, is my personal favourite movie of all time, is that people like myself, fans of the movie, maybe super fans or even just casual fans sometimes, will go into a sequel or a prequel or definitely a remake expecting it not to be as good. Even if they hope that it's as good or hope that it's better, they are subconsciously, 9 times out of 10, realistically expecting it not to be as good. Now, that being the case isn't necessarily a bad thing. Expecting that to be the case isn't necessarily a bad thing. Where it becomes a problem is expecting it to be a bad film can tend to put you in a mindset where you only see the failings in a film which agree with that preset idea. And that can quite simply cause you to miss out on enjoying something which, no, is not as good as the original, but when considered in its own right, is a nice addition to the original. Because there are certain films which may affect the way you think of an original film, but this is not one of those occasions. Now, the 2011 version of The Thing does a few notable things differently to the original, and the things that are done differently, for the most part, I do like. There are some things which I definitely don't, and there are two in particular which I don't like about this film, and we'll get into those first. And they're not spoilers, this is a totally spoiler-free review. And the two things that I don't like are, one, that the movie has timeline inconsistencies which could have pretty easily been solved. That is disappointing. That shows a lack of thought from the planning and writing point of view. And also from the directing point of view, because the director should have researched the original, he should have been more of a fan of the original, and should have realistically seen those inaccuracies and fixed them. That, though, didn't happen, and that's very disappointing to me. The second thing that's disappointing, and this is probably the most disappointing thing given how iconic the original is in this regard, is that the company involved in making the practical effects in this movie, Studio ADI, were completely undersold by the fact that all of the practical effects used were then covered with CGI. That is such a stupid thing to do. It's a total lack of respect for the craftsmanship behind those special effects, and they are amazing. You can even watch videos of the real practical effects behind this film on YouTube, and those behind the scenes footage videos actually look genuinely better than the CGI in the movie. Now, that being said, it may sound like I'm hitting on the movie, hating on the movie, and saying, well, you might as well watch the behind the scenes instead of the full feature. That's not the case, not at all. I actually would recommend watching this film with an open mind to fans of the original. I'm a fan of the original, a super fan even, and I still love this movie. Is it as good? No, categorically not. Do I enjoy it as much? No, I do not, and I'm not rating it as high either, of course not. However, there are some very specific good choices made in this film, which for me personally at least, do at least cancel out the bad things to enough of a point to make it worth watching. Because for one thing, this particular movie has two primary female characters. The original has no female characters at all, and not only in this movie are the two female characters, but they are not sexualized at all, and they serve roles in the story. One character in particular, played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and they play good roles in the film. As I said, Mary Elizabeth Winstead is the primary character in the film. You've also got Joel Edgerton in there, you've got Adewale Akinnuoye-Agbaje, who played Killer Croc in Suicide Squad, and a number of other known faces. Not necessarily A-list faces, but known faces from other movies. And although you may not like the cast as much as the original, I certainly don't like the cast as much as the original, it's a pretty difficult cast to beat. The original was really well cast, and for its time, I think this one was as well. Now, the movie is set, as of course the prequel classification suggests, before the original, and that's where the timeline issues come into play. Now, people who say that this movie shouldn't show what went on before the original film because it ruins the mythos, are kind of wrong, because there is a major spoiler in the original movie. Anyone who can speak the Nordic language in the original The Thing, very quickly and very early on in the film, get the entire concept of the movie spoiled if you can understand that Nordic language. Because a certain character who comes into the film very early on literally explains exactly what has happened to them, but most English speakers don't understand what he's saying. So to say that this ruins the backstory is actually false, because they literally spouted out what happened in the first film and you just happen not to understand it. So that's not a knock against this film. And another main thing that I do really like about this version of The Thing, or this prequel to The Thing, is actually kind of a spoiler. It's not really a spoiler, but for the sake of those who don't want to hear it, I'm going to put a sign up on the screen as of now. And for those who don't care about the spoilers, of course, you can keep listening. But the thing in particular which I like about this film is the way the monster is presented. In the original movie, it does a very great job of blending in with the people and only breaking out of its cover when necessary. A lot of people hated on this film because the creature in this movie, which is supposedly the same creature, just bum rushes people and attacks them out of nowhere for no reason instead of blending in. People hate on that, and initially you can understand that thinking, but that's actually wrong, because this is set before those events. And think about it, this creature has never dealt with humans before, not that we know of, so of course it's going to bum rush them. It doesn't know what it's dealing with, compared to the other creatures in space, which this organism has dealt with in the past. Humans probably seem fairly primitive and easy to beat, so of course it would just attack them outright. But then it would suddenly realise, oh, actually these people are intelligent, they work together, and they create weapons that are very effective. So by the time the original movie comes around, it learns that it needs to blend in instead of just attacking head on. That is not a bad thing. In fact, that's a very clever thing. It shows that the Thing creature learns. This is an excellent example of the creature learning from this movie into the original film, which of course in the timeline comes after this. And that's the end of that spoiler portion. A very minor spoiler, but for those who didn't want to hear it, of course. Now, overall, I'm not going to rate this film as highly as the original, and the concept behind the movie, some people have said, is a little bit too similar. But to be fair, there's only so far you can go. Of course it's going to be similar because we already know some of the things that happened based on the events of the original film, so there's not too far that you can stray from that. Now, whether or not the film should have been made at all is an entirely different but very legitimate question. That I may have a different opinion on. Would I rather have seen a sequel? Yes, I would have. I would personally love to see a sequel along the lines of either the graphic novel version of The Thing, which takes place after the original, or even the video game version of The Thing, which also has an excellent storyline. Either of those would have been a better option than this film. But again, that doesn't make this a bad film. The fact that we got a prequel is just a bonus. And although some people don't like it, which I can understand, there are certainly things in there which aren't great, some of which I've already covered, but overall I do appreciate the chance to see The Thing on screen again. And as I've said before about The Thing a number of times, the personal reason why I believe The Thing is the best monster ever created is because by the nature of its design, it never looks the same twice. And you cannot get more creative than that. When you have a Freddy Krueger or a Michael Myers or a Jason Voorhees, they always look essentially the same. They might change their outfit, or the design of them may change fractionally over time depending on what bag or mask they're wearing on their head, but the essential concept of the character doesn't change. With The Thing, it does. Every time you see it, it's a person, it's a dog, it's a bug-like beetle creature. It changes radically, and I love that. It means that it never gets boring, and you always want to see what it's going to look like this time, what kind of abilities it's going to have this time, and to some more or less of a degree, how intelligent is it going to be this time, because it's as intelligent as the creatures that it has most recently become. So with all that being said, what about scores? Well, of course you can cross-reference these scores with my original Thing review, which I'm going to put a link to at the end of this video, but first of all we have the story and the plot. Now for the story and plot, I am going to rate it lower than the original. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10, because I do still consider it to be above par. As I said, I like some of the things done, some of the other things not so much. One of them towards the end, which I'm not going to spoil, I would have liked to have seen done differently. And if you've seen the movie, and you know what I mean by the ending, you can actually check out the alternate ending on YouTube, which would have been a much better idea. But that's for another time. So overall, it's a 6 out of 10 from me. It does a good job of being a horror movie with a great creature and paying homage to the original, but it's not as clean cut, it's not as well made as the original, so of course, it's not going to get the same score. As far as the characters as well, I'm also not rating it as highly, and to be honest, I don't feel, looking back now, that I even rated the original high enough. The characters are fantastic in the original. In this one, I do still like them. I like the cast that they had. I like the multinational casting, which again, the original did not have. And having men and women on the cast is a nice change. It sets it apart again from that original. So overall, I'm going to give the characters and the motivations as well, the decisions they make, the casting, the overall development of the characters, the way they work together or don't work together, which is the case in these films, a 6. I think that they were good enough, they were above par, but certainly not as good as the original, of course not, and I never expected them to be. As far as the visuals, the special effects, makeup, practical effects, CGI, all that kind of good stuff, and sometimes not so good stuff, I'm still actually going to give it an 8 out of 10, because it is definitely not as good as the original, not even close. Now, had they actually just used the animatronic practical effects, the puppets, the makeup, then actually I would have said it could have maybe even surpassed the original. And I know fans, or some fans at least, will say that that's heresy. I'm a super fan of the original, but you could definitely make even better versions or better creations using practical effects in the vein of the original. There are some things which do look B-movie-esque in the original. Not in a bad way, but for its time that worked, and it still works. This 2011 movie could have had the modern equivalent of those excellent practical effects, but unfortunately what we got instead was CGI over that. To be fair, the creatures still look fantastic, they just don't look as good as they should. So it's still an 8 from me, but it could have quite easily been a 10. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, of course the music of the film, I'm still going to give it a 7, and that may seem to be quite high because I have heard some people saying that they don't like the soundtrack of this movie compared to the original, because it does have a similar soundtrack. The original has a fantastic soundtrack, I play it regularly, but it doesn't sound as good, or it has some changes made which are a little bit cliched compared to the original music. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but it's not something which bugs me, certainly not as much as the visuals of the film do, and the lack of the practical effects that I already mentioned. For me, I like the sound design, the creature still sounds fantastic, and the music is certainly good enough for a prequel. I don't expect it to be as good as the original, and if they'd have just copied the original, people would have complained about that as well. Which again is the problem with a remake or a prequel. People always compare it to the original and give it a demerit, pretty much by definition, which isn't really fair. And finally, that brings us to the most subjective, to me personally, the rewatchability and entertainment factor. And actually for this 2011 prequel, I'm still going to give it an 8 out of 10. It's definitely not as good as the original movie. Of course not, I would never even claim that it's close to the original. But what you need to do when you go into this movie is try and see the good things that it did. And there are plenty to look at. It's not a bad film by any stretch. On Rotten Tomatoes, for instance, this has a 35% score, and that is ridiculous. The fact that that score is so low is quite simply false. Now, of course, that's an aggregate score based on loads of scores put together, but still, there are plenty of movies which are higher than that, which definitely don't deserve to be in comparison. It just has this stigma because of how excellent and outstandingly good the original was. So overall, for me, it's an easy 8. I love watching this movie. I've watched it a number of times. I like the clever choices that are made, such as the one which I mentioned earlier in the spoiler section. And overall, I didn't expect it to be as good as the original, and so I wasn't disappointed when it wasn't. And overall, that means that as a tabulation of those categories all put together, I'm giving the 2011 prequel to The Thing still a pretty decent score of 3.5 out of 5. And in comparison to the original, I gave that film a 4.1. So they compare surprisingly well. And as I said, had I gone back now to the original, I may rate it even higher in a couple of ways. But overall, if you haven't seen this film and you have seen the original and you liked it, I would recommend doing so and go into it expecting the things which I said are good, and maybe don't give it a pass, but focus more on the good things. It's far from being a perfect film, but the things which it does well, it does very well. But that's it for this review overall. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.